Tonight, our our webinar is called Rules of the Game, and our focus tonight is going to be maintenance-related FAA regulations, and I think this is important for every aircraft owner because, in my experience, aircraft owners aren't usually taught what they really need to know about maintenance regulations. We go through pilot training, we learn all about the regulations with respect to flying the airplanes, then we take the plunge and buy an airplane, but we don't go through owner training, and so frequently the new regulations that affect aircraft owners are not very well learned. So we're going to try to go through quite a few regs tonight that bear on maintenance of aircraft. Our primary focus is going to be Part 43. That's the portion of the regs that deal with maintenance. Part 43 is mostly written for mechanics, but yet for aircraft owners to manage their maintenance in the way that the regulations require, they really need to know the rules of the game that mechanics play by, because as aircraft owners we have to have a partnership with our mechanics, and if we don't understand what rules they're constrained by, it gets very hard. Fortunately, Part 43 is very short. There are only 13 rules and 5 appendices in all of Part 43, compared to about 250 rules and 7 appendices in Part 91, which is the stuff that we as pilots have to study. Bill O'Brien, who before he passed away was the chief maintenance guru at the FAA, used to joke at IAA renewal seminars that that Part 43 has only 13 rules because mechanics have short attention spans. I don't think that's true, but the Part 43 is amazingly concise, especially considering that it was written by FAA lawyers, and it's actually amazingly well architected. And because there are so few rules in Part 43, we'll basically go through them all tonight. We'll also be talking about selected maintenance-related rules from other parts of the FARs. We're going to start out talking a little bit about some definitions of maintenance terms. Definitions appear in Part 1 of the regs. We'll talk about a couple of things that are in Part 21. Part 21 deals with certification of aircraft and aircraft parts, and for the most part, we're not really interested in Part 21 unless we are planning to certify an airplane, but there are a couple of things in Part 21 that aircraft owners need to know about, specifically the rules about ferry permits and the rules about what replacement parts are legal to install on certificated aircraft. We'll look a little bit at Part 65. Part 65 deals with certification of non-flying airmen. It's kind of like the Part 61 that we are so familiar with, except that it deals with non-flight crew airmen, like air traffic controllers and parachute riggers, and but in this case we're going to focus on what it says about A&Ps, and particularly what their privileges and limitations are. And then we'll spend a little time on Part 91, the section of Part 91 that deals with owners' responsibilities for maintenance. So that's kind of a roadmap of what we'll be talking about, and let's start off by defining some of the basic terms that appear in the regulations with regard to maintenance. And the reason I'm going through this is that some of the FAA definitions of these terms are not exactly intuitive. They're not exactly what you would expect them to mean. And so to understand what the regulations mean, you have to understand what these words mean. So let's start off with the word maintenance. The Part 1 definition in the FARs of the word maintenance is that maintenance means inspection, rebuilding, overhaul, repair, preservation, and replacement of parts. And we'll talk about a couple of those things. We'll talk specifically about what rebuilding and overhaul means. But the word maintenance excludes preventive maintenance. Now that's very surprising. That's not the way most people would use the words. They would normally think that preventive maintenance would be a subset of maintenance, but the FAA says that preventive maintenance and maintenance are two mutually exclusive things. Preventive maintenance specifically is the list of operations enumerated in Part 43, Appendix A sub C, that aircraft owners are allowed to do on their own recognizance without having to get a mechanic involved. And there are about 36 of those listed in Part 43, Appendix A sub C. About 24 of them apply to airplanes, and the other 12 of them apply to other things like rotorcraft and hot air balloons and stuff like that. But there are this list of things that aircraft owners are allowed to do on their own without getting a mechanic involved to either do them or supervise them or sign them off. You know, for example, we could do our own oil changes, and that's because doing the oil change and the filter change and so on are listed in this appendix of the FARs that define preventive maintenance. So the basic difference between maintenance and preventive maintenance is that maintenance must be performed, or at least supervised, by a mechanic or an FAA-approved repair station, whereas preventive maintenance is allowed to be performed by a pilot-rated aircraft owner, provided that the aircraft is not used for commercial operations. If the aircraft is used for commercial operations, such as Part 121, 135, 129 operations, then the owner loses his preventive maintenance privilege. So if an airplane goes on a Part 135 certificate, you can't do your own oil changes anymore. Mechanic has to do it. But as long as the aircraft is only used for Part 91 non-commercial operations, you can do any of these preventive maintenance tasks that are listed in the regs. Now, another comment is that whenever we use the word inspection with regard to regulations, inspection is one of the parts of one of the things that are included in maintenance. We always mean an inspection required by regulation, something you have to do. So, for example, a pre-buy is not an inspection. Asking a mechanic to come over and take a look at something is not an inspection. There are really only 4 kinds of inspection that we ever have to worry about that are required by regulation. There are annual inspections. There are 100-hour inspections, which are required under certain circumstances. We'll talk about that in a bit. There are progressive inspections, which are kind of like annual inspections on the installment plan. And then there are special inspections, which are typically mandated by Airworthiness Directive. Those are the only things for which we use the word inspection. There are things required by regulation. So, for example, my company does lots of pre-buys, and we never talk about doing a pre-buy inspection because a pre-buy is not an inspection. We call it a pre-buy examination to avoid using that regulatory word inspection that has a very significant regulatory meaning. Appliance is another funny FAA word. You know, most people think of appliance as a refrigerator or a stove or something like that, but in the context of the FARs, the word appliance has this very strange definition, and I'll sort of explain to you why it's the way it is. What Part 1 says is appliance means any instrument, equipment, part, or accessory. I think it also says appurtenance that is used or intended to be used in operating or controlling an aircraft in flight, that is installed in or attached to the aircraft, and that is not part of an airframe, engine, or propeller. Now that's a very weird definition. The logic behind it is this. For the purposes of the regulations, the FAA treats everything that is every part of an aircraft as falling into one of four categories. It's either an airframe, it's an engine, it's a propeller, or an appliance, which is sort of the catch-all for things that don't fit into any of the other categories. So, for example, an altimeter is an appliance, a GPS navigator is an appliance, simply because it's not an airframe, engine, or propeller, and because it's attached to or installed in the aircraft. So anyway, these are the sorts of things that fall under the word appliance. And it's just a catch-all category in the regulations. One important thing to note is that one of the criteria for something being an appliance is it has to be installed in or attached to the aircraft. And the FAA interprets that as being installed in or attached to the aircraft with some sort of structural attachment. As I said, Velcro don't count. So things that aren't actually physically attached to the aircraft in a structural way, for example, a yoke-mounted GPS or an iPad or something like that, are not considered appliances. They're not considered part of the aircraft. From the FAA standpoint, they're considered baggage. So they're not subject to any of the regulations. They don't need to be certified. We call them PEDs, portable electronic devices. And fortunately, the FAA has taken the position that portable devices, i.e. things that are not attached to the aircraft structurally, are off their radar screen. So they don't have to be certified. We can do anything we want. And this is absolutely wonderful because we get much higher technology at much lower cost when we buy something that isn't installed in the airplane than when we buy something that is installed in the airplane and has to be certified. And it's a great boon. I hope the FAA never changes its mind on this policy. This policy isn't written anywhere, by the way. It's just the way the FAA has chosen to interpret the regs, and in particular, interpret the words installed in or attached to in this particular part of the regulation. Instrument. There's another interesting definition. Instrument means a device that uses an internal mechanism to show visually or orally, that is, something you can see or something you can hear, the attitude, altitude, or operation of an aircraft or aircraft part. So, for example, an attitude indicator is an instrument. A flap position indicator is an instrument. A stall warning horn is an instrument. It happens to be an oral one, not a visual one. Autopilots are instruments because the reg actually specifically calls out autopilots as being an instrument. That's right in Part 1. Now, this definition is a little bit dated because nowadays we use lots of instruments that don't really have internal mechanisms. They have software. And at some point, probably the wording of this definition will have to change in the reg. But basically, glass counts as being instruments. It doesn't literally have to have a physical mechanism. It can have a simulated mechanism that's implemented in software, and it still counts as being an instrument. Now, the reason the word instrument is important to define is because it is one of the things that are specifically called out in the regulations that mechanics are not allowed to work on. An A&P mechanic may perform repairs or alterations on virtually everything on an aircraft, with two specific exceptions, and only two. A mechanic is not allowed to do major repairs or alterations of a propeller. Only an FAA-approved propeller repair station may do those. A mechanic is allowed to dress the blades, do some minor dressing, but anything beyond that must be done by a propeller repair station. Mechanics are not allowed to do very much of anything to a propeller other than dress the blades and paint the tips. And of course, remove and reinstall the propeller so that it can be sent off to an FAA-approved propeller repair station. And mechanics are not allowed to do any repairs or alterations, not even minor ones, to an instrument. Only an FAA-approved instrument repair station may do that. And so again, a mechanic's allowed to remove an instrument and send it off to a repair station, but he's not allowed to open the case. You know, one of the funny things is if you look in aircraft spruce catalog, for example, you'll see compass repair kits for repairing whiskey compasses. And spruce is absolutely legal to sell those kits. But nobody but an instrument repair station is technically allowed to install one of those kits, which is sort of interesting. Of course, that regulation's broken all the time, but that's what the regs say. So, instruments and propellers are off limits for mechanics. Now, one of the reasons it's important to know that is that since mechanics are not allowed to work on instruments and not allowed to work on propellers, most mechanics don't know very much about instruments or props. So if you have a question about instruments or props, don't ask your mechanic. Ask an instrument repair station or a propeller repair station, because they're the guys that are allowed to work on these things, and they're the guys that know about them. Mechanics don't. These things are off limits for mechanics. Another interesting limitation in Part 65 is that a mechanic may not perform any work he has not done before, except under the supervision of another mechanic who has done the work before. Now, that's a very common sense regulation, but it's probably the most violated of all maintenance regulations. Mechanics are constantly doing work that they've never done before. But technically, they're not allowed to do that. The first time they do anything that they've never done before, they're supposed to be under supervision by somebody who has done it before. Another limitation is that a mechanic may not perform an annual inspection or approve a major repair or major alteration. We'll talk a little later about what major repairs and major alterations are. But a mechanic may not perform an annual inspection or approve a major repair, major alteration, unless he holds an inspection authorization. And so he has IA next to his A and P. And to get an inspection authorization, you have to have been a mechanic for a minimum of 3 years, and then you have to go through a fairly grueling examination to earn your inspection authorization. And unlike mechanics, the mechanic certificate looks like a pilot certificate, it's good forever. But inspection authorization certificates are only valid for 2 years, and so IAs like me have to get them renewed every 2 years, and there's various ways that we can do that. Okay, a couple of other definitions, and these definitions are actually not in Part 1, they're in Part 43. Definition of the word overhaul. Overhaul of an aircraft, airframe, engine, propeller, appliance, or part requires that the thing be disassembled, cleaned, inspected and repaired as necessary, reassembled, and tested using procedures acceptable to the FAA. Now, we typically repair things, and the actual technical term that's used, the term of art that's used, is IRAN, inspect and repair as necessary. But an overhaul goes beyond that. The big deal with an overhaul is that that when you do an overhaul, you have to do testing, and you have to do the testing following normally the manufacturer's overhaul manual. So overhaul tends to be a much bigger deal than a repair. An even bigger deal than an overhaul is a rebuild. Rebuild is defined in Part 43 as meaning to overhaul something to new limits as opposed to just service limits, and the rebuild must be performed by the original manufacturer. So an engine shop cannot rebuild a Continental or Lycoming engine. Only Continental can rebuild a Continental engine, and only Lycoming can rebuild a Lycoming engine. So the word rebuild implies new limits, and it also implies that the work is performed by the manufacturer who originally manufactured the thing that's being rebuilt. By the way, please don't call these things remans. I hate that term. The proper term written into the regulations is rebuild. And you will never, ever hear Continental or Lycoming referring to what they do as a reman. It's rebuilt engine. Also, we often hear the term factory rebuild. But the term factory rebuild is a redundant term because the word rebuild implies factory. Only the original manufacturer, only the factory can rebuild an engine. I don't even know if Tim is old enough for this one, but back in 1974, there was this TV series, I guess that's 40 years ago, called The $6 Million Man. And it always opened with this stuff. Astronaut Steve Austin, a man barely alive. Gentlemen, we can rebuild him. We have the technology, and so on. And I always loved this when I was doing IA renewal seminars, because I would put this thing up, and then I would say, is rebuild the proper word here? Can we rebuild him to new limits? Probably can. By the original manufacturer? I don't think so. So at any rate, I always had fun with that. But these words really matter a lot. There's this hierarchy of things we can do to an unairworthy component to make it airworthy again. We can repair it. And again, the technical term for that is an IRAN, inspect and repair as necessary. We can overhaul it. We can have it rebuilt by the original manufacturer, or we can throw it out and replace it with a new one. The thing at the top tends to be the most expensive. The thing at the bottom seems to be is typically the least expensive. And so normally the trick is to use the least expensive one of these options that gets the job done. So these words matter. And we shouldn't ever use the word overhaul unless we mean it. And we definitely don't want to use the word rebuild unless we really mean it. Airworthy. Airworthy is one of the most common words in the regulations. Interestingly or not, until a few years ago, it wasn't defined anywhere in the regulations. It was defined in some other FAA publications and stuff, but now there's actually a definition in the regs. For an aircraft, airframe, engine, propeller, or appliance to be airworthy, it must meet two criteria. It must conform to its type design, and it must be in condition for safe operation. Now, note that EAB aircraft can't be airworthy by definition because they don't have a type design with which to conform. An EAB aircraft can only be in condition for safe operation. It can't be airworthy. The word airworthy is undefined for an EAB aircraft because there's no type design to comply with. That's why for EAB aircraft, for example, we don't do annual inspections. We do condition inspections. The purpose of an annual inspection is to determine whether the aircraft is airworthy, but you can't do that for an EAB aircraft. The purpose of condition inspection is to determine if the aircraft is in condition for safe operation. And so that's what we do on EAB aircraft. So the word airworthy only has meaning in the context of a certificated aircraft or a certificated component, because there has to be a type design. Now these two criteria of airworthiness, the first one, which is conforming to type design, is theoretically an objective standard. You've got an aircraft over here, you've got a type design over here, which is written down on a piece of paper. It's a bunch of drawings and specifications and stuff. And either the aircraft meets that type design or it doesn't. So at least in theory, compliance with type design is an objective standard. Being in condition for safe operation is a totally subjective standard. It's somebody's opinion. At an annual, it's typically the IA's opinion. Before every flight, where the pilot is required to determine if the aircraft is in condition for safe operation, it's the pilot's opinion. But being in condition for safe operation is always somebody's opinion, and it's inherently subjective. And two different people can reasonably disagree whether an aircraft is in condition for safe operation or not. But conformance to type design, at least, is theoretically an objective standard. Now, when we say that the aircraft conforms to its type design, which is one of the requirements for it being airworthy, it either has to conform to its original type design or to its properly altered type design, because we may wind up altering the type design of the aircraft over time, typically by adding alterations that are STC'd, alterations that are covered by a field approval, minor alterations that we'll talk about later. But frequently an aircraft that's 10 years old has had its type design altered in various ways, but by having the aircraft altered in ways that the FAA approves of. And so for the airplane to be airworthy, it has to conform either to its original type design or to its properly altered type design. This regs is out of Part 91. We all hopefully know it by heart. 91.7 says no person may operate a civil aircraft unless it's in an airworthy condition. And the pilot in command is responsible for determining whether the aircraft is in condition for safe flight and shall discontinue the flight when unairworthy conditions occur. So what this says is we have to hire a high-priced IA to make an airworthiness determination on the aircraft once a year. If it's used in commercial ops, we may have to get a mechanic to do it every 100 hours. But the pilot in command has to make an airworthiness determination every time he turns the key. Now, obviously, the pilot in command is not going to be able to make as sophisticated and well-educated airworthiness determination as an IA can. But the pilot does have an obligation to make an airworthiness determination before every flight. And in fact, during every flight. If the airplane becomes unairworthy in the course of the flight, then the pilot is required to discontinue the flight. Now, normally the rule is that we don't, no person may fly an aircraft unless it's in airworthy condition. That's what 91.7 says. But the problem is sometimes we have to fly airplanes in unairworthy condition. Sometimes they become unairworthy in inconvenient places where there's nobody available to fix them. Sometimes they become unairworthy because somebody forgot and the annual expired, and the airplane isn't on a field where there are any maintenance services, so we have to fly the airplane somewhere where we can get the annual done. So the FAA provides a special dispensation for flying unairworthy aircraft, and it's called a ferry permit. Ferry permits may be issued by the local FSDO. That's typically how they're issued. They may also be issued by designees called DARs, designated airworthiness representatives. And there are certain purposes for which ferry permits are allowed to be issued. They can be issued to fly the airplane to a maintenance shop, or to fly it to storage, to evacuate it from impending danger. If the airplane's out of annual and a hurricane is bearing down on the airport, you can get a quick ferry permit and fly the airplane away even though it's out of annual. A couple of other things, production flight testing and so on, which don't affect most of it. I did an article for Sport Aviation magazine a few months ago that went into quite a bit of detail about exactly how you get ferry permits. I won't spend a lot of time on it now, but basically you get an FAA form called 8130-6, which is available on the web, and fill it out. You get an A&P to make a logbook entry stating that the A&P has inspected the aircraft and considers it safe to make the proposed ferry flight. That's a very, very low standard. The A&P is not saying that the airplane is airworthy. Obviously, if it was airworthy, it wouldn't need the ferry permit. He's just saying that he thinks it can fly another 20 minutes. And so we get a logbook entry saying it can fly another 20 minutes. We get our filled out FAA Form 8130-6, fax both of them to the FSDO, then follow up by telephone, and typically, unless there's something that really catches the FAA inspector's attention, they'll fax you back a ferry permit the same day, and you're good to go to make the ferry flight. Ferry permit is good for one flight. Replacement parts. There's some stuff in Part 21 about replacement parts. Replacement parts, replacement and modification parts for sale for installation on certificated aircraft must be PMA approved, and we'll talk in a moment about exactly what PMA means. With 4 specific exceptions. The parts don't need to be PMA approved if they come from the original aircraft manufacturer. Parts from Cessna are automatically approved for a Cessna without any further paperwork besides them coming from Cessna. TSO'd parts, and we'll talk about that, are approved. Standard parts, which I'll talk to you about in a second, are approved. And owner-produced parts are approved if they're produced by the owner for his own aircraft, which is sort of an interesting thing in the regulations. Standard parts are either mil-spec parts, things with AN, MS, NAS, SAE, or AS part numbers on them. Think of things like rivets and bolts and nuts and washers and that sort of things. Those are standard parts. Stainless steel controlled cable, pulleys, stuff like that. Also, the FAA in 1997, I think, expanded the definition of standard parts to include standard electronic parts, resistors, capacitors, diodes, transistors, and non-programmable integrated circuits. So those are considered standard parts. Prior to 1997, if you needed a 100K half-ohm resistor for your King KT76 transponder, you would have to buy it from Bendix King, and they would have to sprinkle Bendix King holy water over the resistor in order to make it legal. Since 1997, you can go down to Radio Shack, buy that resistor, and stick it in. It's perfectly legal because it's considered to be a standard part. I'll talk about some of these alphabet soup things. PMA stands for Parts Manufacturer Approval. TSO stands for Technical Standard Order. STC stands for Supplementary Type Certificate. A PMA is basically an approval from the FAA to a third party to manufacture parts for an aircraft manufactured by somebody else. So, for example, if anybody but Cessna wants to manufacture parts for a Cessna, they have to go to the FAA and get a PMA to do it. And they have to demonstrate to the FAA that their parts are at least as good as the Cessna parts that they replace, and that they have an appropriate quality control program in place to satisfy the FAA that they will continue to be at least as good as the parts that Cessna manufactures. And if a company can do that, then the FAA will issue them a PMA, and now they're good to go to make Cessna parts. So things like Superior or ECI cylinders that are replacements for Lycoming Continental cylinders, Rapco brake parts that are replacements for Cleveland brake parts, all those sorts of things are PMA parts. A TSO is kind of like a PMA. but it's for items that have such broad applicability that they basically don't care what kind of aircraft they're installed on. So things like radios, flight instruments, life rafts, ELTs, those are typically TSO'd instead of PMA'd. TSO is for stuff that really doesn't care what kind of airplane it's installed in or aircraft it's installed in. PMA is for parts that do care what they're installed on. But otherwise, PMAs and TSOs are very similar, and the procedure for getting them is relatively similar. STC is a somewhat different animal. STC relates not to direct replacement parts, but to modifications, for alterations. You need to go and get an STC if you want to sell an alteration that the FAA considers to be a major alteration. Things like, horsepower increases, installing a 180 horsepower engine in place of the original 150 horsepower engine. Or a stall kit, which, changes stall speeds and stuff. Replacing the original incandescent lighting with strobes is considered a major alteration that requires an STC. Sometimes even wacky things like sun visors will have STCs on them. But in any case, STC is an approval for an alteration to the aircraft, a modification, whereas PMA and TSO really relate to replacement equipment. Now, PMA and TSO are both approvals to manufacture and sell parts. The STC is an approval to install something that alters the type design of the aircraft. So frequently you need both. A company will get an STC for an alteration, and then we'll have to get a PMA to manufacture the parts that are required to make that alteration. Owner-produced parts is sort of interesting, and I did a whole webinar on that, I believe. That's on the EAA server. But very briefly, a mechanic may maintain, repair, modify parts, but a mechanic is not allowed to produce a new part. However, under the regs, aircraft owners may produce new parts as long as they're for their own aircraft and they're not for anybody else's aircraft. It's sort of a funny reg because the FAA has all of the strict controls over what kinds of parts are allowed to be installed on certificated aircraft, and then they create what kind of looks like a big giant loophole saying that owners can make their own parts for certificated aircraft, and those parts are perfectly legal. And oh, by the way, if he sells the airplane, they continue to be legal. And the reason the regs are written that way is because if there wasn't any provision for somebody making parts, there are a lot of airplanes that could never fly again. I mean, if you got a Funk 24 and you crunch a wing rib, you can't just call up Funk and order a new one. It has to be fabricated by somebody. And the FAA, in its infinite wisdom, gives that authorization to the aircraft owner. So what exactly does it mean for a part to be owner-produced and fall into this very unusual exception to the regs that say it doesn't have to be PMA'd? Well, the FAA issued a letter of interpretation explaining that, and they basically said that the FAA will consider an owner-produced part to be owner-produced if the owner is involved in almost any meaningful way in the production of the part. And they itemized 5 possible ways the owner might be involved in the production of the part, and if any one of them happens, then the part it will qualify as an owner-produced part. The owner could provide the design data for the part, or the part to be duplicated, and go to a machine shop with either the drawings or the broken part and say, make me one of these. And as long as the owner provided the data or the part to be duplicated, it's considered to be an owner-produced part. The owner could provide the materials to make the part, could specify the fabrication processes or assembly methods to make the part, could perform quality control on the production of the part, or could simply supervise the manufacturing of the part. And if the owner does any of those 5 things, any one, then the part qualifies as an owner-produced part. So it's trivial to qualify a part as an owner-produced part. Here's the hard part, the hard part of owner-produced parts. Owner-produced parts have to be airworthy, so they must conform to the aircraft's type design. So how are you going to prove that your owner-produced part conforms to the type design? Well, there are basically only 2 ways to do that. You either obtain the design specifications, like the original drawings and stuff, which usually is not possible, because usually the drawings aren't available. If the company's out of business, the drawings probably aren't available, and if the company's in business, the drawings are considered to be proprietary information that you can't get your hands on. So the other way that you can show a part to conform to its original type design is to reverse engineer the original part. And that's allowed under the FAA. In fact, that's exactly how a company like, for example, ECI gets permission to make replacement Continental cylinders. They buy a whole bunch of Continental cylinders and slice and dice them and measure everything and test all the metallurgy and reverse engineer the specs, and then develop their own cylinders following those specs and demonstrate to the FAA through tests and computation that their cylinders are essentially the equivalent of the original cylinders that they're designed to replace. Now, an owner-produced part that is to be used for a major repair or a major alteration. Let's say it's not a wing rib, which is, excuse me, a minor alteration. But let's say we want to create a owner-produced wing spar. Now that's a major repair. And for an owner-produced part to be used for a major repair, we're going to need an IA sign-off and submit a Form 337 to the FAA. And no IA in his right mind is going to sign off an owner-produced wing spar, because that's way above an IA's pay grade. So the IA is probably going to say, well, I can't sign this off unless you hire a designated engineering representative, a DER, who can do all of the structural analysis and demonstrate that that wing spar conforms to the original type design. And so doing an owner-produced part for a major repair is a pretty big deal. But doing an owner-produced part for a minor repair is no big deal at all. Now, if a part for an airplane that you need is ridiculously expensive, or just there aren't any place, there are a couple of options. You can work with your A&P and see whether there's some way to retain and utilize some portion of the original part and fabricate the rest of it around it and have your mechanic document it as a repair. There are no rules about how extensive a repair is allowed to be. So if you could salvage 5% of the original part and fabricate 95% of the original part, you could still get away with calling it a repair. If the original part is just disintegrated into primordial ooze, then you may have to talk to your A&P about the possibility of working with you to fabricate an owner-produced part. And owner-produced parts typically always have to be done as sort of a partnership between the owner and the A&P, because the owner is the guy that has the regulatory permission to produce the part, but the owner doesn't have permission to install the part. The A&P has the permission to install the part, and the A&P has to be convinced that it's airworthy. So the best way to get an owner-produced part done is to is to engage your A&P as sort of a co-conspirator and work on the project together. Okay, talk about Part 43. There are only 13 rules in all of Part 43. They define who can work on aircraft, the minimum standards for inspections and for repairs, what records must be kept, who can sign off the work, exactly what a mechanic's signature means, and definitions of overhaul and rebuild that we've already seen. And then there are 5 appendices to the regs, which define things like what kinds of repairs constitute major repairs or major alterations, what kinds of things are preventive maintenance that owners are allowed to do, what must be included in an annual or 100-hour inspection, how to prepare and submit a Form 337, and how to perform biennial certifications of altimeters and transponders. Who may do the maintenance? Maintenance, preventive maintenance, and alterations can be done by mechanics, repair stations, Part 121 or 135 operators who effectively have a little repair station built into their operation, and repairmen. In this context, a repairman is somebody who holds a repairman certificate that gives him privileges to work on aircraft in the context of his employment with a repair station. It's a little bit different than the limited repairman certificate that EAV people are familiar with, which gives privileges only with respect to a particular aircraft. But the typical repairman certificate is carried by somebody who's an employee of a repair station, allows him to work on aircraft in the context of that repair station, but it doesn't give him any privileges outside that context. So if he quits his job or if he wants to moonlight over the weekends, he can't. The repairman certificate doesn't let him do that. It only gives him privileges while he's working for the repair station. Rebuilding and inspections may be performed by manufacturer. Rebuilding, of course, can only be performed by manufacturer. The holder of a private pilot certificate or higher may perform preventive maintenance. Those are the items in Part 43, Appendix A sub C, on any aircraft owned by that pilot as long as it's not used for commercial operations. The holder of a light sport aircraft pilot certificate may perform preventive maintenance on any light sport aircraft owned by that pilot. And of course, there's no exclusion for commercial operations because light sport aircraft inherently can't be used for commercial operations. Supervised maintenance. This is an interesting part of the reg. A person working under the supervision of a mechanic may perform the maintenance, preventive maintenance, and alterations that his supervisor is authorized to perform. So a mechanic can delegate his magical powers to anyone. Doesn't need to be an aircraft owner, doesn't need to hold a certificate, only has to have a pulse. And by the way, this is the way people gain the experience to become A&Ps. They start out as apprentices, working under the supervision of a mechanic. And when they're apprentices, they don't hold any certificates. They're just learning. But a person working under the supervision of a mechanic may do anything that the mechanic is allowed to do, as long as the mechanic personally observes the work being done to the extent necessary to ensure that it is being done properly. And it's totally up to the mechanic how much observation is required. Most of the experience I got while I was working up to getting my own A&P was work under supervision, and the supervision was largely of the, Mike, you know what you're doing, call me when you're done variety. And it's totally up to the supervising mechanic how much or little supervision he feels is necessary. The supervisor also has to be readily available in person for consultation. That means if you're working under supervision and you get in trouble, you got to be able to call your supervisor over so he can bail you out. And within those, with those two limitations, an uncertificated person can do anything to an aircraft. You know, you can overhaul engines. You can literally do anything under supervision, as long as the supervisor, your supervising mechanic, is comfortable with it. No person may operate an aircraft after maintenance unless it has been approved for return to service by an authorized person, and the required maintenance entry, the maintenance record entry, has been made. Now, approval for return to service requires paperwork, basically. At minimum, it requires a signed logbook entry. It's either a 4311 entry for inspections. We'll look at some of those entries in a minute, or 439 entry for anything other than inspections. If it's a major repair or major alteration, it'll also need a Form 337 signed off by an IA. And if the work involved any revisions to operating limits or flight data, for example, something was installed to change weight and balance, for example, or something that was installed that changed the stall speed or something like that, then those revisions to operating limits or flight data are part of the paperwork required to approve the aircraft for return to service. Approval for return to service requires a signature by an authorized person. Who's the authorized person? Well, it depends on what work was done. If it was minor repairs or alterations or a 100-hour inspection, any mechanic can approve that. If it's an annual inspection or a major repair or major alteration, then it takes a mechanic with an inspection authorization, an IA, to do that. If it's preventive maintenance, like an oil change, then the pilot-rated owner is allowed to approve it. He can sign the logbook entry himself. Again, if the work was done in a repair station, then the repair station signs it off. If it was done by a commercial 121 or 125 or 135 operator, then they sign it off. And in the case of a rebuilt something by the manufacturer or a special inspection by the manufacturer actually signs it off. That's fairly unusual. But it requires an authorized person or an authorized signature to approve the airplane for return to service, and whose signature depends on what work was done. No person may carry a passenger after maintenance that may have appreciably changed flight characteristics or performance until a test flight has been made and logged. I did a whole webinar on this subject, but any maintenance that has the potential for changing flight characteristics or performance requires a post-maintenance test flight without passengers, and that test flight has to be logged before you're allowed to carry passengers. This is a reg that is frequently not observed, but it's an important one, I think. Logbook entries. There are basically two different kinds of logbook entries. We call them 43.9 and 43.11 entries. The 43.9 entries are the run-of-the-mill logbook entries for anything other than inspections. So if you take the airplane into a shop and have an oil change or a tire change or something like that, you get a 43.9 entry. A 43.9 entry, the reg for that says that each person doing work must make a maintenance record entry containing a description of the work performed, the date the work was completed, the name of the person who performed the work, and an approval signature with the person's certificate number and certificate type. And it goes on to say that the signature on this 43.9 logbook entry constitutes approval for return to service only for the work performed. And let's look at that sentence for a second. It's got two parts to it. The signature constitutes approval for return to service. So there's no need to have any words in the maintenance record entry saying, I approve this aircraft for return to service. Simply the signature does that. The signature constitutes the approval for return to service, and no magic words are necessary in a logbook entry to approve the aircraft return to service. And then it says it constitutes approval for return to service only for the work performed. And that is very important because it means that the mechanic's signature on one of these run-of-the-mill logbook entries only means that the work performed was airworthy or was done properly. It doesn't mean that the aircraft is airworthy. So it's got a very limited meaning. And the example I usually use is take an airplane into the shop. It's got two discrepancies. The right main tire is flat and the left wing is missing. And you ask the mechanic to change the tire. And he changes the tire and he makes a logbook entry, and it says that he changed the tire and he signs it off. And that's fine. And then on the way out he says, you know, I couldn't help but notice that the left wing is missing, and you know, if I were you, I probably wouldn't fly the airplane until that's rectified. But the signature in the logbook entry doesn't mean the airplane is airworthy. It's obviously not airworthy. It doesn't have a wing. All it means is that the work he performed, in this case the tire change, was done properly. So it's a very limited meaning signature. So for example, here's a typical 43-9 entry for an oil change. Has a date of completion, has a description of what was done, has a signature with a certificate type and certificate number on it, and that's what's in one of these 43-9 entries. We see these things all the time. And again, when I sign that entry, even though I'm signing it as an A&P, it doesn't mean that I've inspected the aircraft and considered it airworthy. It just means I did the oil change and I did it correctly. That's all it means, nothing more. The other kind of logbook entry is what we call a 4311 entry. And 4311 entries are records of inspections, and they're totally different than 43-9 entries. The person approving or disapproving return to service after an inspection must make a maintenance entry containing a description of the type and extent of the inspection performed, like it's an annual inspection, for example, the date of the inspection, the total time in service of the aircraft, some magic words that I'll show you in a minute that basically say whether the aircraft passed or failed the inspection. Because inspections are pass-fail. You either pass them or you don't. Either the aircraft was determined to be airworthy or it wasn't. And then a signature and the certificate number and type. So there are basically two kinds of 4311 entries. Those where the aircraft passed the inspection and are airworthy, and those where it flunked the inspection. Here's the usual kind, the kind where it passed the inspection. We've got a date, we've got hours, time, and service, and here are the magic words. And these words, by the way, come right out of the regulation. They're written right in the reg, 4311. I certify that this aircraft has been inspected in accordance with an annual inspection and was determined to be in airworthy condition. And then the IA signature, and you're good to go. And this signature has a very broad meaning. It doesn't just mean the work performed was airworthy. It doesn't even talk about work performed. It means that every molecule and atom of your aircraft has been determined to be airworthy by the inspector. Now, of course, in the real world, that's impossible, but theoretically, that's what it means. It's a very, very broad approval, and it's said that IAs sign their life away every time they sign off an annual, and basically that's true. The other kind of 4311 sign-off is where the aircraft was disapproved for return to service. And I did a whole webinar on this thing called How to Flunk an Annual Inspection. It gets a lot more detail. But This one has a different set of magic words. It says, I certify this aircraft has been inspected in accordance with annual inspection. So far, it's the same. And a list of discrepancies and unairworthy items dated, whatever the date is, has been provided to the aircraft owner or operator. So basically, this says I did the inspection, the aircraft was unairworthy, I made a list of the unairworthy items, handed it to the aircraft owner, and the inspection is done, but the aircraft has not been approved for return to service. In fact, it's been disapproved for return to service because it is explicitly unairworthy, and I've documented why it was unairworthy on a separate list that I handed to the aircraft owner. If the aircraft owner flunks the annual, it's not approved for return to service due to discrepancies, the inspector gives this signed and dated list of discrepancies to the owner and operator. This is separate from the logbook entry now, and it doesn't go into the logbook. Once he's done that, once he's signed off this entry and handed the list of discrepancies to the owner, the inspection is complete. It doesn't have to be inspected again for another year, or if it was a 100-hour inspection, for another 100 hours. It's completed its inspection. It's just not airworthy. The aircraft may not be flown until the listed discrepancies have been corrected and the aircraft approved for return to service by some authorized person. But it doesn't have to be an IA. It doesn't have to be in the same shop. It can be corrected by anybody who is authorized to perform and sign off the repairs. So this is called signing off an annual with discrepancies. Here's an example real quick. This was annual signed off with discrepancies by Cutter Aviation Albuquerque. It's a Cessna 340. And it says complied with annual inspection using a Cessna 340 maintenance manual. Aircraft found unairworthy at this time. A list of discrepancies and unairworthy items is provided to the aircraft owner. Then the rest of this aircraft entry, logbook entry, is stuff that Cutter did. It doesn't, not the discrepancies. The discrepancies are on a separate sheet of paper handed off to the airplane owner. The aircraft owner then got a ferry permit, flew it to New Mexico somewhere, Alamosa, Colorado, and this other shop, Mountain View Aeromotive, repaired the discrepancies, and here's the logbook entry for that. Repaired items from the Cutter Albuquerque work order, or whatever it is, and a big long description of what they did. In 1979, the FAA issued a new regulation called 4312, making it a violation of the regulations to falsify logbook entries. Believe it or not, prior to 1979, there was no regulation that made it a violation to falsify logbook entries. And so the FAA was a little bit handicapped in how they could proceed against a mechanic or a repair station that falsified maintenance records and said that they did things that they didn't do and that sort of thing. So they came out with this Reg 4312, and it's the main tool now that the FAA uses against mechanics. If a repair station, mechanic, or even an aircraft owner who's doing preventive maintenance falsifies or alters an aircraft maintenance record for a fraudulent purpose, the FAA can yank all of his certificates. If it's a business, they can impose very large civil penalties, I think $250,000 per offense. But signing off a maintenance record that is false is by far the most serious violation that a mechanic can commit. And if he's caught doing it, typically it will end his career, and sometimes it'll land him in prison. So this is a very serious business. Performance rules. Each person performing maintenance shall use the methods, techniques, and practices prescribed by the manufacturer or acceptable to the FAA, and shall use tools, equipment, and test apparatus recommended by the manufacturer or in accordance with accepted industry practices. Methods, techniques, and practices acceptable to the FAA means either stuff that the manufacturer prescribes in its maintenance manual or instruction for continued airworthiness or service bulletins, or as prescribed by the FAA in advisory circulars typically. The big one is AC 43131B, which is an advisory circular about the size of a good-sized telephone directory. That's kind of the mechanic's Bible. So if a manufacturer doesn't tell you how to do something, then you look it up in AC 43131B, and it usually tells you how to do something, and it's just all full of good stuff. But those are considered acceptable methods by the FAA. Now, when we talk about methods, techniques, and practices, we're talking about how to do something, not when to do it. How-tos prescribed by the manufacturer typically have to be followed by regulation. 4313 says so. But when-tos prescribed by the manufacturer may usually be ignored unless compliance is explicitly mandated by the FAA in an AD or in an airworthiness limitation. But so if the manufacturer says we want this prop to be overhauled every 6 years, you don't have to do that. That's a when-to. But if the manufacturer says here's how nicks have to be dressed out, then those procedures are compulsory, because those are how to do something, not when to do something. So it's important to distinguish between how-tos and when-tos. So as an example, a maintenance manual for your airplane prescribes all the following things. It's got an annual or 100-hour inspection checklist in it. It says that flexible flammable fluid carrying hoses have to be replaced every 5 calendar years. It says magnetos have to be disassembled every 500 hours. And it says spark plugs, when they're installed, have to be torqued to 330 inch-pounds plus or minus 30. You're a Part 91 operator, non-commercial operator. Which of these things is compulsory? The only thing that's compulsory is the spark plug torque. The spark plug torque is a how-to, so you have to follow it. The hose replacement interval and the mag inspection interval, those are when-tos. Those are non-compulsory. Doesn't matter what the manufacturer says. You don't have to do it. The annual inspection checklist is not compulsory. The FAR concerning inspections allows an IA to use any annual inspection checklist he wants, not necessarily the one the manufacturer provides, including one that he devises himself and writes on the back of an envelope over breakfast that morning. So an IA must use an inspection checklist, but it can be any old checklist he wants to use. Does not have to be the one in the maintenance manual. So of all these things, the only thing that's compulsory is the torque on the spark plugs. Performance standards for mechanics or anybody who works on an airplane, including owners when they're doing preventive maintenance. Work must be done in such a manner and use materials of such quality that the condition of the item worked on will be at least equal to its original or properly altered condition with regard to aerodynamic function, structural strength, resistance to vibration, deterioration, and other qualities affecting airworthiness. So what that means is that when we do maintenance on an airplane, it's not sufficient to do the maintenance to a safe to fly standard. It has to be at least equal to the original condition that the aircraft was in when it left the factory. Now, it doesn't have to be at least equal cosmetically. It doesn't have to be pretty. But with regard to all of these things affecting airworthiness, strength and resistance to vibration, deterioration, stuff like that, it has to be at least equal to the way it came out of the factory. That is the basic performance standard that mechanics are obligated to perform. Rules for inspections, these are like annuals and 100 hours. Each person performing an annual 100-hour inspection shall determine whether the aircraft meets all applicable airworthiness requirements. That includes compliance with ADs, by the way. He must use a checklist, an inspection checklist, but he may use any checklist he wishes or devise his own Part 43, Appendix D defines a minimum scope and detail for annual or 100-hour inspections. It's kind of like a minimum generic checklist. And but the IA may use his own checklist that he made up himself, or may use the one from the Cessna Pilots Association. If he doesn't have to use the one from Cessna. And he must run up the engine. Those are the requirements of 4315. There are a few other things in 4315 about rotorcraft and stuff, but I won't get into that. There is this concept called airworthiness limitations that affect mostly newer designed aircraft, things like Cirruses and Diamonds and so on, that have airworthiness limitation sections in their maintenance manuals. And the reg says each person performing an inspection or maintenance specified in an airworthiness limitation section of the manufacturer's maintenance manual or ICAs shall follow the manufacturer's instructions. Even if they're when-tos, they must be followed. So airworthiness limitations always are non-negotiable. They must be performed exactly as documented. Now, most legacy aircraft that were certified under CAR3, like the Cessna 310 I fly, and most engines that were certified under the CAR13 regs, like almost all Lycoming and Continental engines, do not have any airworthiness limitations because the concept hadn't even been invented yet when they were certified. But newer aircraft like the Cirrus and the Diamond and the certified Columbia aircraft, that sort of thing, those aircraft typically do have airworthiness limitations, and those have to be followed to the letter. They're just as if ADs were issued. They're non-negotiable. We talked about Part 43, Appendix A. It has basically 3 lists of things in it. A list of things considered to be major alterations, a list of things considered to be major repairs, and a list of things considered to be preventive maintenance that owners are allowed to do on their own recognizance. A major alteration is an alteration that might appreciably affect weight and balance limits, not weight and balance itself, but the limitations on weight and balance, like max gross weight or CG envelope or something like that. Structural strength, performance, power plant operation, flight characteristics, or other qualities affecting airworthiness, or can't be done by accepted practices or elementary operations. Those would be major alterations. Any other alteration is a minor alteration. The difference between major alterations and minor alterations is that minor alterations are basically within a mechanic's pay grade to do, just on his own signature, without any rigmarole. A major alteration has to be inspected and approved by an IA. It has to be documented in a Form 337 that's sent into the FAA. It's a big deal. It's above a mechanic's pay grade, essentially. And so the determination as to whether an alteration is major or minor is made by the mechanic who's doing it. And if he determines that it's a major alteration, it has to be performed in accordance with approved data, which is typically a SDC. Has to be inspected and approved and signed off by an IA, and it has to be documented on a Form 337 that's sent into Oklahoma City. If he determines it's a minor alteration, then it can be performed in accordance with just acceptable data and documented with a simple logbook entry with a mechanic's signature, and nobody else has to know about it. The FAA doesn't have to know about it. No IA has to get involved. It's just a very simple deal. When we talk about data, it means drawing specifications, methods, techniques, and practices. And there are 2 levels of data. There's approved data and acceptable data. Approved data is one that has the signature of an FAA employee on it. So STCs, field approvals, airworthiness directives, those are the typical source of approved data. Acceptable data is just data that complies with all the regs, but doesn't necessarily have to have ever been looked at, much less signed off by an FAA type. So advisory circular service bulletins, other accepted industry methods, techniques, and practices are all acceptable data. So all we need is acceptable data to do minor repairs and minor alterations. But if it's a major repair, major alteration, we have to have approved data that has been blessed by somebody in the FAA. The owner or operator of an aircraft is primarily responsible for maintaining that aircraft in an airworthy condition, including compliance with applicable airworthiness directives. All of these 91-400 series regs use the phrase owner or operator. And when they use the word operator, they don't mean the pilot. They mean somebody who may not technically own the aircraft, but effectively is acting as if he owns the aircraft. Typically, it's somebody who is leasing the aircraft. So when it says owner or operator, typically if you can just pretend it just said owner. Owner or somebody standing in for the owner. But operator doesn't mean pilot. A lot of people get that confused. Owners are responsible for deciding what maintenance to do, and mechanics are responsible for doing it properly. So the burden of getting maintenance done and deciding what maintenance has to be done falls on the shoulders of the aircraft owner. The mechanic's responsibility is to make sure that the work that the aircraft owner has hired him to do is done properly. Each owner or operator of the aircraft shall have the aircraft inspected per 91-409, so which means annual inspections and sometimes 100-hour inspections, and shall ensure maintenance personnel make the appropriate maintenance record entries approving the aircraft for return to service before they fly the airplane. So there's dual responsibility for maintenance records. Mechanics are responsible for making them, but owners are responsible for ensuring they're made before they fly the aircraft, and then for retaining them, for keeping them. And we get into a big problem here because a very, very common scenario is the owner goes down to the shop, pick up the airplane on a Friday, and the mechanic says it's done, here's the keys, here's the invoice, and I'll have the logbook sticky for you first part of next week. And then the aircraft owner jumps in the airplane and flies off into the blue for the weekend, and he's in violation because the aircraft, the work may have been done, but without that signed logbook entry, the aircraft has not been approved for return to service. Now, most of the time, nobody's the wiser. But if something happens to go wrong over the weekend, maybe the shop worked on the landing gear and somehow the landing gear doesn't come down, then the FAA is going to get involved, and first thing they're going to do is go try to find the maintenance records for the aircraft. And when they discover that the pilot flew that airplane after maintenance without an approval for return to service, without a signature in a logbook, the shop's not in trouble. It's the pilot that's in trouble. The shop can take all the time it wants to get that logbook entry done, but the owner is not allowed to fly the airplane until he has that signed logbook entry. So owners quite frequently get in trouble with this. You never want to take an IOU for a maintenance record entry. Getting your airplane back doesn't do you any good unless you get the signature in the logbook that says it's legal to fly. So that's really important. 91-409, required inspections. No person may operate an aircraft unless within the preceding 12 calendar months it has had an annual inspection and has been approved for return to service. No person may operate an aircraft carrying passengers for hire or giving flight instruction for hire unless within the preceding 100 hours it has had an annual or 100-hour inspection and has been approved for return to service. Again, this is a reg that is often not properly understood. You don't need to do 100-hour inspections unless you're either carrying passengers for hire or giving flight instruction for hire in the aircraft. So if it's a flying club airplane, you don't need it. If it's a rental airplane, you don't need it. if you're carrying cargo, you don't need it. The only time you need to do 100-hour inspections is if you're carrying passengers for hire, which normally would mean that you're a Part 135 operator, or you're giving flight instruction for hire, and the flight instruction is being given by the company or the person that is providing the aircraft. Those are the only times you need to do 100-hour inspections. Most people don't have to do 100-hour inspections. In lieu of doing annual and 100-hour inspections, the FAA allows an operator to elect to place his aircraft on an FAA-approved progressive inspection program, which effectively is an annual inspection on an installment plan. Instead of one big inspection, it's multiple smaller inspections. Typically, for most piston aircraft, the progressive program is 4 different phased inspections spaced 50 hours apart. Large airplanes over 12,500 pounds and multi-engine turbine airplanes are required to use a manufacturer supplied inspection program or some other FAA-approved inspection program. Progressive inspections normally only make sense for commercial operators who fly more than 200 hours a year, because they typically are 4 50-hour inspections. So unless you're flying more than 200 hours a year, it doesn't make sense. And for most owners, even ones that fly more than 200 hours a year, doing a conventional annual works out better than doing a progressive program. So progressive programs are mostly used by commercial operators that simply can't stand having the aircraft being down for more than a day or 2 at a time. Large airplanes are over 12.5 and multi-engine turbine airplanes have much stricter maintenance rules than piston engine airplanes or single-engine turbines. So the rules for a King Air, which has 2 engines, 2 turbine engines, are much, much different than, say, for a Pilatus PC-12 or a TBM 900 that only has a single turbine engine. Single engine turbines are treated almost exactly the way piston aircraft are treated, and the rules are very permissive. Once you get that second turbine engine installed, then it becomes a really big deal, which is why my company explicitly does not do anything with multi-engine turbine aircraft. We limit our practice to pistons and single-engine turbines strictly. Biennial certifications. No person may operate under IFR unless within the preceding 24 calendar months each altimeter and encoder has been inspected per Part 43 Appendix E by an avionics shop. And no person may use an ATC transponder, may not turn it on, unless within the preceding 24 calendar months it has been inspected and found to comply with Part 43 Appendix F. So altimeter and encoder certs are needed only if you fly IFR. Transponder certs are required for any flight that requires a transponder. I have a feeling that this rule may change, because if you have a certified transponder that you're allowed to turn on, but you have an out-of-spec encoder that's putting out bad altitude information, nowadays it causes all sorts of trouble with TCAS and stuff. And so I would not be surprised if at some point the FAA changes this and says that the encoder certs are required even if you don't fly IFR. Because anytime you turn on the transponder to mode C, you're broadcasting that altitude information. And if it's bogus, it can cause all sorts of problems in the ATC system. But this is the way the reg is specified now. Maintenance records. We talked about the fact that owners are obligated to verify that the maintenance records have been properly made, and then to keep them. What kind of records do owners have to keep? They have to keep all the normal logbook entry kind of records: maintenance, preventive maintenance, alterations, 100-hour inspections, annual inspections, progressive inspections, other required inspections for each aircraft, engine, propeller, or appliance. If the aircraft has any life-limited parts, then the owner has to keep records of time, total time, time since overhaul, time since last inspection, and so on. Now, most of us don't have aircraft that have life-limited parts unless we're flying maybe a pressurized aircraft that has a life-limited windshield or something. So for most of us, we don't actually have to keep time records. Current status of applicable ADs, compliance with ADs, and copies of any Form 337s that have been filed for major alterations. How long do we have to keep those records? That's sort of surprising. The 91.417, which is the applicable reg here, says that for normal logbook entries, maintenance, preventive maintenance, alterations, annual inspection, stuff like that, we only need to keep the records until the work has been repeated or for 1 year, whichever comes first. So in theory, at least, we could throw all our logbook entries out after a year. Now, I don't recommend you do that, especially if you ever plan to sell the airplane, because the buyer of the airplane is going to want to see a nice complete logbooks. But on the other hand, suppose you get crosswise with the FAA, and they ask to see your maintenance records. What are you going to provide them? Well, under the reg, you only have to provide them the last year's worth of maintenance records, at least for all the normal stuff. So it's kind of like the IRS. If they require you to keep 7 years worth of tax returns or tax records, and then you get an audit, you're not going to bring 10 years into the examiner, are you? You can bring in just what you're required to bring in. And for aircraft owners, we're really only required by regulation to keep records for a year or until the work has been repeated. In other words, anytime you do an oil change, any records of prior oil changes could theoretically be thrown away. Again, I'm not recommending you do this, but that's what the requirement is. On the other hand, records of time, records of AD compliance, records of Form 337s for major alterations, those records have to be kept indefinitely. And if you sell the aircraft, you have to transfer them to the new owner with the aircraft. And finally, there's a third category, which is 4311 discrepancy list. If you have an annual inspection signed off with discrepancies, and the IA hands you a list of defects, those become part of your maintenance records on a very temporary basis. But you can throw out that list as soon as the defects have been repaired and the airplane has been, aircraft has been approved for return to service. So they're only very temporarily part of your maintenance records, and the reason they're supposed to be on a separate sheet of paper and not put in the logbook entry is to facilitate you getting rid of them, or getting rid of the record after it no longer is applicable. Aircraft owner would be wise to maintain his aircraft maintenance logs and records in the owner's personal possession, at the maintenance facility, or in the aircraft. This is one that just drives me nuts. The right answer is in the owner's personal possession. Way too many owners are in the habit of leaving their logbooks at the shop. That is a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea for lots of reasons. First of all, the shop might lose the records. If they lose the records, your aircraft will have been severely devalued. So you want those records locked up in a nice fireproof safe somewhere. Second of all, if you happen to get into an argument with the shop and you get mad at them and you say, I'm not going to pay that invoice, that's not what I bargained for. If the shop has your logbooks, they'll hold them hostage. I've seen this happen time and again. You don't want to give a shop the opportunity to hold your logbooks hostage. So you always want to keep your logbooks in your personal possession. On our managed maintenance aircraft, we never allow the logbooks to get anywhere near the shop. We provide the shop with electronic copies of the logbook scans, which is all they ever need, and we require all their logbook entries to be made on self-adhesive stickers that go to the owner so the owner can put them in the logbooks. The logbooks themselves never get anywhere close to the shop. You definitely don't want to keep logbooks at a maintenance facility. And keeping them in the aircraft is crazy. Nobody wants you to do that. The NTSB doesn't want you to do that because if you crash, they don't want the maintenance records to burn up. The only right answer to this question is that logbook entries should always be kept in the owner's personal possession. And finally, under the regs, you as an owner are required by regulation to verify that the return to service logbook entries have been made and signed. How are you going to do that if the logbooks are down at the shop? You have to have them in your hot little hand. So, at any rate, so much for that. If an annual, here's another one that gets people real confused. We're just about done here. If an annual inspection is signed off with discrepancies, as unairworthy in other words, and it's still less than 12 calendar months since the previous annual inspection, the aircraft may be flown to another location without need for a ferry permit. A ferry permit is needed to fly the aircraft, or the aircraft can't be flown until the discrepancies are corrected. And the right answer is you need a ferry permit. The moment the new annual started, the old annual became moot. That just because the old annual was less than 12 months ago doesn't mean your airplane is still an annual. The commencement of the new annual, each inspection moots all prior inspections, no matter what the timing is. So you can't. I mean, the last annual said your airplane was airworthy. This annual says your airplane isn't airworthy. The notion that you could rely on the old annual saying it was airworthy 12 months ago when an IA just finished saying it's not airworthy now and fly the airplane without a ferry permit doesn't make sense. But people do that all the time. They think that if it's not 12 months, then they're good to go. You definitely need the ferry permit to fly. Saying the aircraft may not be flown until discrepancies are corrected is also wrong. We can always fly an unairworthy airplane as long as the FAA agrees to it by issuing its ferry permit. So, at any rate, that's the answer to that one. Tim, that's all I have. That's quite a bit. We probably don't have a lot of time for Q&A. I apologize for that, but I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Wow, that was extremely comprehensive, Mike. Yeah, we did actually.
A little too comprehensive. Probably should have been 2 webinars.
Well, probably enough material for 2 webinars, but it was great material. Thank you so much. We did go over by a few minutes here, but let's get one question, and I think it's an interesting one. Under what circumstances can a non-TSO radio be installed in the aircraft, say a Stearman? I have one shop saying no, and another says yes.
Well, the basic rule is that the radio requires either a PMA or a TSO to install in the aircraft, and it has to have one or the other, or you could always get something installed on a field approval, but it's a certificated aircraft, so it needs some sort of paperwork to say that it's legal. Nowadays, almost everything that is sold is TSO'd unless they're avionics specifically intended for experimental aircraft. But obviously, a Stearman is not an experimental aircraft, so you have to play by the rules.
Okay, and let's take this question here as the last one here. John's just wondering, I belong to a club where all members are co-owners of the aircraft. Are we individually allowed to do preventive maintenance?
Well, that's an interesting question that is nowhere answered in the regulations, and I'm actually not aware of any specific FAA letter of interpretation on that issue. My own personal interpretation is that yes, that any owner of an aircraft that has a private pilot's or greater license certificate does have the preventive maintenance privilege. So, you know, I wish I could refer you to a higher authority on that, but I'm not aware that there is any higher authority. I can't see any good reason why they should not all have preventive maintenance privilege. I mean, nobody's ever questioned it, for example, with respect to a two-owner aircraft. And I don't see any difference in principle between a two-owner aircraft and a 50-owner aircraft. I think the owners are all owners, and they all meet the requirements.
Sounds good to me. Great. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for this extremely comprehensive review of the regulations, which can be awfully confusing, but you did a great job demystifying it, for me at least. It was a good presentation. Thank you so much. Any last closing comments you want to make to the attendees tonight?
Other than apologizing for running long. Well, I actually have a somewhat exciting announcement, at least exciting for me. My first book is about to be out. It'll actually be available just prior to AirVenture, and we'll be running a special on it for AirVenture, and it's called Manifesto: A Revolutionary Approach to General Aviation Maintenance. It's the first of a 5-volume set that I'm working on, but this is the first one, and it should be available probably within a week to 10 days. And if you look on my SavvyAviator.com website when it's available, there'll be a link for buying it on Amazon. And if you are signed up for my newsletter, then you'll get notified by the newsletter when it becomes available. Upcoming webinars, August 13th, which is a week later than usual because of AirVenture. We'll be doing one on resolving owner-mechanic disputes. And then on September 3rd, I don't think you even know about this one yet, Tim.
No, I don't think so.
We'll be doing one on pre-buys, which is a subject that comes up a lot. So we'll be talking about pre-buys. And I think you're about to turn everybody over to the survey, and on the survey there's a checkbox. If you're interested in signing up for my monthly newsletter, you can check the checkbox there, or you can just go to my SavvyAviator.com website, and there's a little place you can sign up for the newsletter there. And we put that out about the middle of the month of each month. The July one should be coming up in about 10 days. So that's all I have. Great. And you're going to be at Oshkosh AirVenture this year doing numerous forums in Forums Plaza, I take it? Yes, many. I think I've got 10 talks on the Forums Plaza. I've got a couple in the AOPA 10 and a couple of some other places, and lots of good stuff going on at AirVenture. So I look forward to seeing everybody there. Fantastic. Well, I look forward to seeing you there, and good luck with the launch of the new book. I like it. Can't wait to get my hands on it and read it myself. So, exciting announcement there. Appreciate that. Well, very good. Thanks, everybody, and good night, Tim. Good night, Mike. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night, everyone.